The question of who killed Jesus is both a theological and historical one, and it has been discussed for centuries in Christian thought, as well as in other religious and historical contexts. Here's an overview of how different perspectives address the question. 1. Theological perspective, Christian view. From a Christian theological standpoint, Jesus' death is seen as a divine plan for salvation. According to Christian belief, Jesus' crucifixion was part of God's plan to redeem humanity. In this view, while human agents, such as the Roman authorities, Jewish leaders, and individuals, were involved in the act of Jesus' death, it is ultimately believed that Jesus chose to lay down his life for the sins of humanity, fulfilling God's will. 1. Jesus' own words, John chapter 10 verse 17-18, suggest that he had the power to lay down his life and to take it up again. 1. Christians believe that Jesus, as the Son of God, was both fully divine and fully human, and that his death was part of God's redemptive plan. 2. The Apostle Paul, in Romans chapter 3 verse 25, talks about Jesus' sacrifice as a sacrifice of atonement, meant to reconcile humanity with God. Therefore, from this theological standpoint, God allowed Jesus to be crucified, but it was ultimately part of God's will for the salvation of mankind. In a sense, it could be said that God chose for Jesus to be killed as a sacrifice for sin, even though human hands carried out the action. 2. Historical perspective, Roman and Jewish involvement. Historically, the Roman authorities and some Jewish religious leaders of the time played key roles in Jesus' crucifixion. 1. The Roman Empire. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate authorized Jesus' crucifixion, a Roman form of execution. 1. Pilate's role is often highlighted because, as the governing authority, only he had the power to order the execution. 1. Pilate, despite questioning Jesus' guilt, ultimately gave in to the pressure from the crowds and religious leaders, and allowed Jesus to be crucified. 2. The Jewish religious leaders. According to the Gospels, some Jewish religious leaders, like the high priests and the Sanhedrin, saw Jesus as a threat to their authority and accused him of blasphemy and claiming to be the Messiah. 2. They played a role in pushing for his death, though they did not have the authority to carry out a death sentence under Roman rule. 2. They thus brought Jesus before Pilate to seek his condemnation. Historical summary. From a historical perspective, the death of Jesus involved both Jewish religious leaders who wanted him executed for blasphemy and Roman authorities who actually carried out the crucifixion. 3. Symbolic and mystical views. Some theologians and philosophers interpret the question symbolically or mystically, suggesting that Jesus' death is a representation of humanity's separation from God, or the suffering of God in human form for the sake of human beings. In these views, the question of who killed Jesus becomes a way of exploring the depths of human sin and God's willingness to enter into that suffering. Conclusion. To answer simply. 1. From a Christian theological perspective, God allowed Jesus' death as part of his divine plan for salvation, but the human agents responsible were the Roman authorities, specifically Pontius Pilate, and the Jewish religious leaders of the time. 2. From a theological perspective, it is believed that Jesus' death was something he willingly chose to undergo for the redemption of humanity, as part of God's plan for atonement. In essence, while human beings carried out the physical act of crucifixion, Jesus' death is seen as part of God's plan, making it a complex and multifaceted event in Christian theology.